This appendix video will cover what modifiers affect heroes and heroic units in the vanilla game, touching briefly on the differences in AOTR. First, it should be noted that while a hero's spell stacks with another hero's leadership, that no leadership or spell or buff will boost another hero's damage or armor. That kind of boost only works on non-hero units. Only speed or sight-related spells work on either heroes or heroic units. We'll demonstrate this in a bit. In AOTR though, select leaderships, buffs, spells, and even debuffs all affect heroes, depending on the faction. Damage and armor buffs for heroes are unique to AOTR and play a big role. Now let's demonstrate each modifier's effect on both heroes and heroic units at once, starting with the leadership modifier. Here we have many heroes of the game that provide leadership, and alongside them we have all the heroic units of the game. Let's see which ones actually buff them. You'll see sparkles over them if they do. Okay, so none of those. What about these? King Dane buffs all heroic units, but not with damage armor boosts. He only grants resistance to fear and terror. If he granted a damage armor boost, there would be a gold glow underneath. It says only orcs get buffed by Gothmog, but it does buff them, the fear and terror resistance. They are minor modifiers to their leadership, and effective only in rare cases, like with Gundalf the White. Now, let's see how spells affect them, starting with Mordor's Darkness. There are only 2 spell modifiers in the whole game that affect heroes and heroic units, but let's cover the ones that do not work first. Regarding the Darkness spell, once again, its description states it works on all ally units, but no heroic unit gets any visual indicator showing them being buffed. Darkness does not work on them. Let's try Dane's spell then. It also says it works on all ally units. But nothing. Let's try Glorfindel's Starlight spell. It also says it's for all ally units. But only the non-heroic sorcerers get the buff. No heroic units are affected by the actual buff itself. Here we have the heroic unit Knights of Dol Amroth. The hidden spell works on only cavalry, but nothing. Let's look at the elves' Farsight spell. Success! Although it only increases attack range and unit sight radius, but it says it stacks with buffs, leadership, and other spells, and any hero is affected by this spell, one of only 2 in the whole game to do so. Notice the only one not affected is the Fire Drake monster unit. Remember, monster units are not affected by spells or buffs, only rare leaderships. What about Isengard's Palantir spell? Another success, but this one only boosts speed while clearing the fog of war in that area. The heroes are again affected, the only other spell to affect heroes. Once again, only the fire drakes are not affected. Only one buff modifier works on heroes and heroic units in vanilla, but again, let's just go through all that don't work first. Let's try Rallying Call. Nothing. War Chant? Nothing. Let's look at the last buffs now. Elven Wood, Tainted Land, and Frozen Land. Frozen Land only works on the non-heroic sorcerer units. Tainted Land? Nothing. And lastly, Elven Wood. Elven Wood actually works on heroic units, the only buff to do so, but only for its fear and terror resistance, not damage and armor. No debuff works on any heroes in the vanilla game at all, and only a fear or terror based side effect of the passive nullifier debuff works on heroic units. Let's show what does not work first. Let's start with Dane's active debuff, which we covered a bit in the main series. Once again, nothing. It should be noted that this one active debuff is representative of any active debuffs in the game. For more on active versus passive debuffs, see Part 4 of the main series. Isengard's Freezing Rain is also representative of all weather-related active debuffs, like Angmar's Blizzard. Let's look at it now. Weather-related debuffs also do not work on heroic units. Lastly, what about passive debuffs like the Witch King? He also will be representative of all passive debuffs, including passive nullifier and normal passive debuffs, like from Lesser Nazgul. See Part 4 of the main series for more on the difference. Some do back away, a sign they are affected by part of the Witch King's debuff effect, like fear or terror, but they are not actually debuffed. So let's recap what leaderships, spells, debuffs, and buffs actually work on heroes and heroic units in the vanilla game. It should be noted up front that for leaderships, buffs, and debuffs, that those offer only effects on heroic units and are not modifying their attributes at all the way modifiers typically do, as with damage and armor boosts. The spells are unique in that while they don't modify damage or armor, they do modify speed, sight, and range. Now, what affects heroic units? Leaderships and buffs? Only fear and terror resistance. No damage or armor boosts. Spells. Only sight, speed, and range. No damage or armor boosts. Debuffs. Passive debuffs. Fear effect only. No actual damage or armor debuffing. Active debuffs. No effect whatsoever. What modifiers work on heroes in vanilla? Simple. Only sight, speed, and range spells. Nothing else. So why take so much time to explore all of these effects on heroic units? Well, much like I discussed at the end of Part 5 in the main series about vanilla's modifiers in general, everything in this appendix video is to introduce a sharp contrast between the vanilla game and AOTR's overhaul on heroes and heroic units. And unfortunately, the boosts that affect them are hardly impactful at all. Sight and speed spells certainly have their place, but if that's all that these units can use, it doesn't realistically add up to much at all. Same holds true for fear and terror resistance. Furthermore, the descriptions for many of the leaderships, buffs, and spells state clearly that all allied units are impacted by the damage armor boosts, when this is clearly not the case at all. Needless to say, this is very confusing to players such as myself, who had for a long time assumed these units were affected by such boosts to damage and armor. The same holds true for many descriptions in AOTR though, to be fair, but it is clearer in many other descriptions. Now, as I've said before, AOTR heroes can be boosted quite a bit by various spells, leaderships, and buffs, affecting both damage and armor, and even by debuffs. AOTR is not limited to just sight and speed buffs for heroes as in vanilla, or for heroic units for that matter. Now let's take a brief look at how it works in the Age of the Ring mod. In AOTR, it's much more dynamic while also being faction-centered, and sometimes even centered on sub-factions within a faction, and sometimes just on certain units of any faction to the exclusion of others, and then in only specific ways. Take Elrond, for example. His leadership states clearly that allies near him are buffed and get the experience boost, but when he gets nearby these specific units, only some are affected. But this leadership effect may not even buff the damage or armor of certain units, but rather just provide the experience boost. What makes this more complicated than in vanilla is that there is an additional class of unit in AOTR not found in the vanilla games, known as the semi-heroic unit. Such units are very powerful tier 3 units. They are often limited in how many of them you can have on the field, like heroic units, but do not go higher than level 5. The Khazad Uzbadul are one such example, which you can see Elrond's leadership affecting now. Another great example of how specific AOTR's system can be is Gondor. With Gondor, you can have the sub-faction of Dol Amroth with its specific units from that geographic area. The leader of that group of units is Prince Imrahil. You can see here that he buffs out only certain troops with his passive leadership. The units to his immediate right are the heroic units called the Swan Knights, very powerful cavalry. Remember from earlier in this video that in the vanilla games, Theoden, the only hero in the vanilla games who has a spell affecting cavalry, could not affect the Knights of Dol Amroth, which are the equivalent of this unit, and not with his leadership either. Prince Imrahil, on the other hand, can affect them with his leadership and one or two abilities. To make matters a little more interesting, consider how the Return of the King summon works just by itself versus how King Elisar himself affects the troops. This summon can have a powerful leadership buff impact if timed right for any and all troops nearby. It stacks with his own leadership too, but watch what happens when the summon buff fades away. You can see he affects the heroic Fountain Guard units in the top left corner, but not the Swan Knights with his leadership. Both units are heroic units, and he doesn't impact the Watchers of Karna heroic unit in the top right for the ROTWK faction, nor the semi-heroic Beorning unit at the bottom for the Mirkwood faction, but he does impact the Khazad Uzbadul semi-heroic unit for the Dwarves. Heroic units can also buff out certain units in AOTR, like the veterans of the Last Alliance heroic unit for the Rivendell faction, buffing out the Khazad Uzbadul for experience gain. This unit doesn't impact only semi-heroic units, of course, but also normal units.
Do you seek our counsel?
And like Imrahil, Mirkwood's hero Grimbeorn only affects the Beorning semi-heroic units, which operate like a sub-faction for the Mirkwood faction.
Keep a steady pace.
Leaderships now also impact heroes in AOTR, a feature completely absent in the vanilla games. You can see the description for the Nazgul and the Witch King state they buff one another out. However, you'll note there is no special effect indicating this, like a symbol floating over their heads or a gold circle beneath them or something. So you gotta be mindful in cases like this. This is the exact opposite for other units like the Khazad Uzbadul, who have a special ability that buffs nearby heroes. You can clearly see the shield icons floating around Elrond and Imrahil.
We must act now. Joel Elrond is at your command.
For spells in AOTR, they can sometimes operate on a more specific level like leaderships, even when saying they are not so limited. Take Mordor's Darkness spell for instance. You can see it says it affects all allied units, but only affects the Khazad Uzbadul semi-heroic unit again in this whole roster, but not the semi-heroic Beornings. Other spells like Boromir's only affect certain semi-heroic or heroic units even when stating targeted friendly units. Buffs operate pretty much the same as the other modifiers. You can see the Khazad Uzbadul are once again the only ones impacted by the Garden of Athelion land buff. You can even see the sparkle over their heads indicating they are immune to fear and terror. But the classic Rallying Call buff still does not affect any of these heroic or semi-heroic units.
This power belongs to all men.
As for debuffs, like in vanilla, the heroic units are still not impacted by them, while semi-heroic units are. Notice the leadership golden circle is also removed by the Witch King. But there are some other very strange ways debuffs work. Watch how the Witch King will take away the experience boost leadership from the veterans of the Last Alliance on the Khazad Uzbadul, but it will not remove the leaderships given by Imrahil or Grimbeorn on their units. Overall, the Age of the Ring system for how modifiers work on semi-heroic and heroic units is ultimately too specific to put in a handy overview page. You just have to try them out per faction and see for yourself. Regardless, it's a refreshing change of pace from the vanilla games to see these great units finally being able to be impacted by modifiers. In these respects, AOTR is the BFME overhaul, which in and of itself takes the whole BFME franchise to new heights and makes it feel like the successor to the original games we never got before.